Snow pressed down on the plains like a white silence, each flake drifting with the patience of time itself. Abigail Whitmore clutched her shawl tighter about her shoulders, breath spilling into the night as clouds of pale worry. The carriage that had brought her rattled back toward town, its lantern swaying out of sight, leaving her alone in the hush of the storm. She had been told this was her husband's ranch, the man her father had chosen for her, the man who would quiet gossip and secure her future. Yet the land felt strange, unfamiliar, as though even the wind whispered she did not belong. Her boots sank into snow that reached her ankles. The shawl, fine wool from her father's household, gathered frost at the edges. Shame burned beneath the cold. She could still hear the whispers from town echoing in her ears. Too large for a bride. No man will truly want her, not for love. A bargain, that was what they had called her marriage. She, Abigail, daughter of Elias Whitmore, reduced to livestock in fine lace. The ranch house she expected was not here. Instead, the land opened to a wide clearing, where a fire flickered low beside a circle of winter-darkened hides. Shadows shifted around it. Shadows of men, taller and broader than any she had known in polite society. Their eyes caught her like lantern flame. For a breath she froze, heart thrumming, until one figure separated from the rest. He stepped through the snowfall barefoot, the flakes clinging to his black hair and melting against the deep scars carved across his chest. Shirtless though the air bit sharp, his body seemed made of the storm, carved from it, as if he could not feel cold like ordinary men. A bow rested easy in his hand, not drawn, but present enough that her knees weakened. Abigail's voice caught in her throat. She had been taught that the Comanche were ruthless, wild, unfit for civilized company. Yet the man who approached her did not lunge nor shout. He studied her the way a hawk studies the horizon, steady and unreadable. When he came close, the firelight revealed a face marked by silence, eyes dark as wet earth after rain. "Please," she whispered, though she did not know what she begged for. "Shelter? Mercy? To disappear into the snow so no one would laugh at her again?" The man's gaze lingered on her trembling hands, on the heavy fabric of her dress that dragged through the drifts, on the beads of frost clinging to her lashes. Slowly, he lowered the bow until its end touched the snow. His lips moved, the words soft, almost swallowed by the wind. "God finally sent you to us." Her breath caught sharp, fear and confusion tangling together. She took a step back, nearly stumbling, the shawl slipping from her shoulders. The others around the fire murmured, though she could not understand their tongue. She understood only that she had been seen, not as her father's burden, not as the town's ridicule, but as something fated. Her mind churned. This was not the ranch she had been promised. Not the husband who had been chosen. She should turn, run back toward the road, wave down the carriage before it vanished into the storm. But behind her lay the weight of gossip, of pitying eyes and cruel laughter. Ahead of her stood a man whose silence was heavier than any judgment, and yet somehow gentler. The snow thickened, flakes settling on her hair. Her body trembled not from cold alone, but from the sudden knowledge that she stood at a crossing of paths. All her life she had been steered, by her father's will, by the town's cruel tongue, by the narrow shape of a woman's fate. Now the storm itself had carried her to the wrong place, to the wrong people, to the wrong man. And yet, perhaps, not wrong at all. The man's chest rose slow with breath, steam curling from his skin into the frozen air. He did not step closer, did not seize her as she had feared. He only waited, eyes steady, as if her presence alone was proof of something he had long expected. Abigail wrapped her shawl tighter, though it no longer warmed her. The world she had known, the father who traded her, the whispers that carved her soul, the groom who would sneer as he claimed her, felt suddenly far away. In its place stretched a quiet, snow-wrapped wilderness, and a man who had whispered words she could not yet understand. "God finally sent you to us." The phrase echoed in her chest, strange and impossible. Sent for what? To whom? She was not a gift, not a miracle. She was the girl too large for dancing, too slow for admiration, too much for love. And yet his eyes did not flinch, did not glance away with pity or disgust. Around them, the storm closed in, blurring the line between heaven and earth. Abigail felt the weight of it press against her shoulders, urging her forward into a story she had not chosen. She had been promised to one man, delivered to another, and now stood suspended between fear and possibility. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words would not come. Instead, the fire popped, casting sparks into the sky like fleeting stars. She thought of the carriage already lost, the road swallowed by white silence. There was no turning back. And so she stood, trembling, her breath sharp in the cold, staring at the scarred giant before her. His whisper had opened a door she had never known existed, and behind it waited something she could not yet name. Snow gathered on her shoulders. The tribe's voices hushed, watching. Abigail's heart pounded with the terror of being seen, truly seen, for the first time. She could not tell if she was walking into salvation or ruin. But when his eyes held hers, steady as the earth beneath snow, she felt something shift inside her, fragile as flame, stubborn as winter grass pushing through frost. The storm roared, and still she stood. The wrong ranch, the wrong fate, perhaps. Or perhaps the only one that had ever been hers. And then he whispered again, voice low enough to rattle her bones. You will understand. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, falling into the snow. She gasped, caught between running and staying, her heart pounding like hooves in the dark. The storm swirled tighter, carrying her into a destiny she could neither flee nor refuse. The fire smoked low inside the Comanche lodge, its glow licking shadows across hides stretched against poles. Abigail sat near the flames, her dress damp at the hem, her fingers stiff from cold. Her body had never felt so clumsy, so out of place. She had been raised among velvet curtains and carved chairs, yet here she sat on packed earth, her shawl heavy with frost, her shame heavier still. The voices outside rustled like wind in the cottonwoods. She could not understand the words, but she understood their tone, caution, suspicion, and the low murmur of laughter. Every sound pierced her, reminding her of evenings in town when Miriam Lowe and the other women lowered their voices, but never enough to keep her from hearing. Too round for grace, too spoiled for work, too much for any man to hold with pride. Her father's voice had cut sharper. Elias Whitmore had not spoken of love when arranging her match. He had spoken of land, cattle, contracts sealed like brands burned into hide. A man will take you, he had said, not gently. And you will not complain. You've eaten enough of my bread to pay it back. The memory of his hand striking the table still trembled through her, louder than the storm outside. Now she was not in the house of her promised groom at all, but in the heart of a Comanche camp, surrounded by strangers whose firelight painted her face in strange colors. She told herself to be afraid, but exhaustion dulled her fear into something else, an aching question. Was this mistake a punishment, or could it be a reprieve? Tahu entered without sound, his bare shoulders dusted with snow. He carried a bowl carved from wood, steam curling above its rim. Without a word he set it before her. Meat, root, broth rich with smoke. Abigail's hands shook as she reached for it, though her stomach had been hollow for hours. She dared a glance upward. His gaze did not dart away in pity or linger with hunger. It simply held her as steady as stone. She ate slowly, ashamed of how fiercely her body begged for it. When the last sip slid down her throat, warmth filled her chest for the first time since leaving town. She meant to whisper thanks, but the words clung like ice to her tongue. Tahu had already turned to mend a spearhead near the fire, his broad back gleaming in the glow. Around her the lodge breathed with silence. The only movement came from a boy, perhaps 7, who slipped inside shyly, his small hands clutching a blanket stitched with bright beads. He approached Abigail, eyes wide, and laid it across her lap without a word. For a moment she could not breathe. She pressed her palm to the child's dark hair, a gesture instinctive as breath, and something softened in her chest. The boy darted back to the entrance, grinning. Abigail pulled the blanket close. It smelled of smoke and leather, unfamiliar yet safer than all her father's polished rooms. She felt the sting of tears, but she bent her head quickly, not wishing anyone to see. Her heart thudded with memory of the town's judgment. Judge Harwood's booming laughter rang in her mind. A heavy bride for a heavy purse. She remembered the way men had chuckled, women had smirked. Her cheeks had burned while she forced a smile, her insides hollow. She had told herself marriage would silence them. Instead she sat here misplaced, in a lodge not meant for her, with a man who spoke few words but whose silence carried more weight than all their mockery. The fire cracked, sparks rising. Tahu lifted his head at the sound, eyes shifting to her, as though he could sense the turmoil in her chest. She met his gaze, startled by her own boldness, and for a heartbeat the world shrank to that narrow space between them. She saw not wildness but weariness etched in the lines around his mouth. Scars across his chest were not trophies but burdens, each mark a story of pain endured. She wondered if he too had known the lash of judgment, if his silence was armor no less than her shawl. The thought unsettled her, even as it soothed. Outside, the wind wailed, dragging the snow harder against the hides. The tribe gathered closer to their fires. Abigail realized she would not leave tonight, perhaps not for many nights. A strange calm spread through her bones, fear and relief tangled, impossible to untwist. She had always been told where to go, what to do, what to endure. Now fate had delivered her to a place no one chose, not even her. Perhaps the storm itself had chosen. Tahu rose, his height filling the lodge. He set aside the spearhead and drew a length of sinew. To her astonishment he stooped to her side, taking her torn hem into his calloused hands. With patient strength he stitched it, thread by thread, his head bowed in concentration. The gesture struck her harder than any words could. No man in her father's house would have lowered himself so. She wanted to speak, to ask why, to offer thanks. Instead she sat silent, heart racing, watching the scarred giant mend what she thought could never be mended. When he finished, he looked at her at last. His eyes were not questioning, not demanding, only waiting. She realized he had expected nothing from her but her presence. That alone, somehow, seemed enough. The wind moaned like a choir outside. Abigail drew the beaded blanket close, her fingers tracing its pattern. A warmth kindled in her chest, foreign and fragile. For the first time she wondered if this mistake was not ruin at all, but the first breath of something else, something she dared not yet name. The child's laughter drifted faintly through the walls. Tahu's gaze did not waver. The fire hissed, wood collapsing into ash. Abigail knew nothing of this world, nothing of its people. She knew only that shame had followed her everywhere she went, heavy as stone. Yet here, in the eyes of a man who did not flinch, the stone felt a little lighter. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, a sharp cry split the camp. Horses snorted, hooves stamping against snow. Men's voices rose in alarm. Tahu straightened, his bow in hand before she could draw breath. The lodge flap flew open. A figure loomed against the stormlight, a rider, face twisted in rage, whiskey stink spilling into the cold air. Abigail's heart lurched as she recognized him. It was the man she had been promised to. The storm had swallowed the camp whole, driving the tribe inward to the circle of firelight. Snow pressed against the hides, muffling the world to a hush broken only by the crack of wood and the murmur of low voices. Abigail sat rigid, her shawl clutched like armor, as the man who was meant to be her husband sneered in the doorway. His breath steamed with whiskey, his boots scattering frost onto the packed earth. "I knew you'd find trouble," he slurred, eyes raking over her like she were a horse sold too cheap. "Even lost, you shame me." The words cut sharper than the cold. Abigail's throat tightened, the old heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. The tribe said nothing, though their eyes shifted toward Tahu. The Comanche warrior stood at her side, silent as a mountain, bow in hand but not raised. He did not move to strike, nor did he shrink from the insult. His stillness was a shield. Her intended spat on the floor, the spittle sizzling near the fire. "She's mine. Bought and paid for." The silence grew heavy, until even the flames seemed to bend toward it. Abigail's hands trembled in her lap, but something inside her had begun to shift. Once she would have lowered her gaze, folded herself into invisibility. But now, with the fire warming her skin and the child's beaded blanket across her knees, she could not. She lifted her chin, though her voice quavered. "I am not yours," she said, barely more than a whisper. Her words startled her as much as him. His eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, hand twitching toward her arm. Before he could touch her, Tahu's body moved, broad chest between them, scarred skin gleaming in the firelight. He did not speak. His silence was louder than rage. The groom cursed, stumbling back, snow swirling in behind him. He muttered threats, promising to return, then vanished into the storm, leaving the lodge trembling with his absence. Abigail released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her body sagged, but the weight that left her chest was heavier than any she had known. Around her, the tribe resumed their murmurs. No laughter now. No ridicule. Only the quiet respect of people who had witnessed a woman find her voice. Days passed. The storm did not relent. Abigail remained among them, snowbound, each hour stretching into a thread that bound her tighter to this unexpected world. She learned the rhythm of the camp, the women grinding corn, the children darting like sparrows, the men sharpening blades in silence. At first she hovered at the edge, awkward as a calf in tall grass. But slowly, piece by piece, she began to move with them. She carried water clumsily, spilling more than she saved. She burned bread over the fire, drawing the children's laughter. Yet none mocked her as the town had. They corrected her gently, guiding her hands, letting her try again. Each failure became less wound and more lesson. Tahu was always near, though he spoke little. When her hem tore again, he stitched it without comment. When she stumbled in the snow, his hand steadied her, rough and sure. At night by the fire, his eyes lingered on her, not with hunger but with the steady curiosity of one watching winter thaw into spring. Abigail felt herself thawing too. Shame still clung, but it loosened in small places. The gossip of Miriam Lowe, the laughter of Judge Harwood, her father's stern decree, those voices still echoed, but softer now, muffled by the hush of snow and the rhythm of survival. One evening she dared to make stew. She misjudged the salt, too heavy-handed, and winced when Tahu lifted the bowl. He ate without flinching, his expression unchanging, but when he set the bowl down he gave the smallest nod. That single gesture warmed her more than any praise. They spoke little, but their silences grew companionable. She caught herself studying his scars when the firelight traced them, long lines across his chest, puckered marks near his ribs. She wanted to ask their stories, but something told her the silence was answer enough. His pain was not so different from hers. Both had been carved by judgment, endured without complaint. At night, wrapped in the child's blanket, Abigail lay awake listening to the storm. She thought of her father, of the carriage lost on the road, of the groom's hateful sneer. She thought too of Tahu's eyes steady upon hers, of the way he mended cloth as though nothing was beneath his hands. A question rose within her, daring and dangerous. What if fate's mistake was the truest gift she had ever been given? On the third night the storm broke. Stars glittered above the plains, sharp as shattered glass. The air bit clean and cold, but the world lay still, blanketed in new snow. Abigail stepped outside, breath catching at the beauty. The camp shimmered as though God himself had poured silver across the earth. Tahu stood near the horses, his bare skin gleaming in starlight. He looked toward her, and for the first time his lips curved. Not a smile, not fully, but enough to crease the edge of his mouth. It struck her like a sunrise. She wanted to step toward him, to bridge the space with the warmth rising in her chest. But footsteps crunched behind her, breaking the fragile moment. She turned. Lanterns bobbed in the distance, voices sharp with anger. More riders from town approached, their shadows long against the snow. At their head rode her promised groom, this time sober, his face twisted with fury and pride. Abigail's heart froze. The silence she had begun to cherish shattered. The world of gossip, shame, and judgment had come riding through the snow to claim her once more. Lantern light broke the stillness of snow, shattering the quiet with angry voices and stamping hooves. Abigail stood frozen, her shawl clutched around her, as riders descended on the camp. The storm had left the earth clean, but now judgment came galloping across its surface, loud and merciless. Her promised groom led them, his jaw set, his eyes burning with possession and pride. Behind him rode Judge Harwood and others from town, their breath rising in pale clouds as if the cold itself carried their scorn. "There she is," the groom spat, dismounting with a stumble. Fat Cow tried to hide among savages. "You think you can shame me like this?" The words struck harder than the wind. Abigail felt them sink into her ribs, each insult reopening old wounds she thought she had begun to heal. Town laughter echoed in her mind, the whisper of women in the mercantile, her father's voice that spoke of contracts rather than love. She wanted to shrink, to fold herself into nothing. Yet her feet did not move. The Comanche gathered silently, their faces unreadable in the firelight. Tahu stepped forward, bow in hand, shoulders squared. He said nothing, but his presence drew a line in the snow no man dared cross lightly. Judge Harwood raised a hand, voice booming. The girl belongs to her lawful betrothed. Step aside. Abigail's heart hammered. Belongs. The word wrapped around her like iron. She had been traded, spoken for, laughed at, weighed like cattle on a block. Rage, fragile but rising, pressed against the cage of her chest. I do not belong to him, she said, her voice carrying into the cold. The men turned, some with surprise, others with smirks. Her groom barked a laugh. Listen to her. Thinks she's better than the hand offered. No man wanted her, so her father begged me to take her. She's nothing without my name. Laughter rippled among the riders. Abigail felt the heat of shame climb her throat, but she forced herself to stand straighter. Better nothing, she whispered, then louder. Better nothing than yours. Her groom's face darkened, fury flaring. He lunged toward her, hand raised. The movement was swift, but Tahu was swifter. He stepped between them, chest bare to the freezing air, scarred flesh like a wall. His bow was not raised, yet his stillness carried more threat than steel. The groom halted, fists clenched. The tension thickened, every breath held. The townsfolk muttered, uncertain. Judge Harwood sneered. Do you prefer this savage? Is that it? You would choose shame over decency. Abigail's voice wavered but did not break. I would choose dignity over chains. Her words startled even herself. She had never spoken such defiance aloud. The silence that followed felt like a verdict. For the first time, she saw the men falter, their cruelty bending beneath her steadiness. But her groom's pride could not bear it. He reached for her again, roaring, You're mine! Gasps rose, hooves shifted, the tribe stiffened. Abigail thought a fight would break like thunder. Blood spilled on snow. But before violence could crack open, her voice cut the air sharper than any blade. No. The single word stilled them. The groom froze mid-step, as though struck. The tribe's eyes turned to her, wide and searching. Abigail's chest heaved, but her gaze did not falter. I am not yours. Not his. Not anyone's to barter. For a moment the world was silent, even the horses hushed. Shame no longer weighed on her shoulders. It burned away, leaving a strength raw and untested but real. Her groom spat into the snow. You'll regret this. No man in town will have you now. You'll be nothing but whispers and pity. Abigail lifted her chin. Then let them whisper. Tahu remained at her side, silent as ever, but she felt the steadiness of his presence like the earth beneath her. He did not claim her, did not speak for her. He simply stood with her, and that, she realized, was enough. Judge Harwood growled, unwilling to yield. Girl, think carefully. Once you turn your back on us, there's no return. You'll be outcast. The words chilled her. The thought of exile, of leaving behind every face she had known, scraped at her courage. Yet when she thought of the town, of its cruel laughter and her father's cold bargains, she realized she had been outcast long before this night. I already am, she said softly. A murmur swept the camp. Snow fell again in gentle flakes, as if the heavens themselves had chosen to weigh this moment. Abigail's eyes stung, but not from shame. From release. Her groom mounted his horse with a curse, his pride too wounded to linger. The others followed, muttering about foolishness, about ruin. Judge Harwood cast her a final look, half pity, half contempt, before turning away. Lanterns bobbed into the distance, until only darkness and silence remained. The camp exhaled. The fire hissed, wood collapsing into glowing ash. Abigail trembled, the weight of what she had done crashing into her. She had severed herself from the only life she knew. She had chosen nothing over a name. Yet in the hollow of that nothing, something flickered. Something fragile, like a flame shielded by cupped hands. Tahu lowered his bow, his eyes steady on her. He did not speak, and she was grateful. Words would have broken her. She needed silence, needed the storm inside her chest to settle. She sank onto the blanket the child had given her, pulling it close. The tribe's eyes lingered but softened. She felt their watching not as scorn, but as witness. For the first time, she did not shrink. Her hands shook, but her spine did not. She had spoken, and in speaking, she had claimed herself. The shame that had clung like a shroud began to loosen, thread by thread. She looked toward Tahu, whose scars glistened in firelight. He was a man shaped by battles, judged by men who called him savage. Yet he stood with a dignity no insult could strip. In his silence, she saw a reflection of her own longing. For worth, for belonging, for something beyond pity and ridicule. Snowflakes drifted down, catching in his hair. He looked at her, and for the first time she did not look away. The fire between them glowed steady, fragile, but real. Then a voice broke the quiet. The chief, old and weathered, stepped forward, his gaze deep as river stone. He looked at Abigail, then at Tahu, and spoke words she could not yet understand. But in the hush that followed, she knew their meaning. This was not the end of her shame. It was the beginning of something far greater. The snow lay deep, bright as moonlight even in darkness, and the camp's fire burned low as though it too waited for what would come. Abigail sat wrapped in the beaded blanket, her body still trembling from the defiance she had hurled at the riders who rode away. She had felt their eyes cut her to pieces, their contempt trailing behind like a noose, and yet she had not bent. She had said no, and the words still reverberated through her chest like a bell rung over an empty valley. She had always been defined by shame, but tonight it had cracked, and through the crack something fierce and trembling had begun to pour. The tribe had gone quiet, watching her in the half-light. No one mocked her clumsy steps now, no one whispered of her size or her worth. She felt seen, fragile but upright, her dignity reborn in the silence of strangers. Only Tahu lingered closest, bow resting near his hand, eyes steady as if he had expected this reckoning all along. He was scarred and shirtless in the winter dark, but his stillness held more warmth than any fire could give. Abigail caught herself studying him, not only as the figure who had shielded her, but as a man whose every scar told her that survival was not just possible but holy. The night held until dawn, when the storm cleared into a brittle sky. She rose with the others, her hands raw as she helped grind corn, fetching water with more steadiness than before. They did not speak much, yet their glances carried weight. The woman who had refused shame might yet belong. By evening the camp settled again, children chasing one another through snowdrifts, laughter ringing like bells, while Abigail stitched with numb fingers by the fire. She felt the world reweaving itself around her, strand by fragile strand. But fate was not finished. Lantern light returned 3 nights later, this time brighter, steadier. A larger band of riders crested the ridge, their voices sharp with anger. Abigail's heart seized as she saw her promised groom again, flanked by twice the men, Judge Harwood among them. This time they carried rifles, and fury hardened their faces. The tribe rose as one, tension bristling, and Abigail felt the fragile peace shudder on its edge. Her groom's voice cut like steel. "Step aside, savages. She comes with me. We'll not have her sully herself here." His eyes flashed with cruel triumph. "She thinks she can shame me? I'll drag her home by her hair if I must." Abigail's body shook, but she forced herself to step forward, her breath frosting the air. "I will not go with you." The judge sneered, raising his rifle. "You think to choose for yourself, girl? The law does not honor such defiance. Your father made the contract." Her lips trembled, but she lifted her chin. "Then the law is a liar." Gasps rippled, half from the townsmen, half from the tribe. The insult cut deeper than any blade, and she knew she had burned the last bridge to her old world. But her voice no longer wavered. She was no longer pleading to be unseen. She was demanding to be recognized. The groom's rage boiled over. He dismounted, stumbling through the snow toward her, hand raised. Abigail braced herself, heart hammering, but before the blow could fall Tahu moved. With a single stride he placed himself between her and the fury, his scarred chest bare to the rifle barrels, his eyes burning like coals. He did not speak, did not roar. His silence was defiance enough. The groom laughed bitterly. "You'd defend her? Then you'll fall with her." He lunged, knife flashing from his belt. Abigail cried out as the blade arced toward Tahu's side. The world seemed to slow, the hiss of snow, the crack of fire, the scream in her throat, and then Tahu caught the wrist mid-swing. The force of his grip bent the man to his knees. The knife dropped, buried in snow, and Tahu flung him back as if he were nothing but straw. The other men raised rifles. The tribe drew bows and blades, the air thick with the promise of blood. Abigail felt the moment tipping toward violence that could not be undone. Her lungs burned as though the cold had pierced her ribs. And then, without thought, she stepped forward into the space between them. "Stop!" Her voice cut through the chaos, raw and commanding. The rifles wavered, the bows eased. The silence was brittle, waiting. Abigail turned slowly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, exposing her trembling frame to both sides. "I am not shame," she said, voice breaking but loud enough to carry. "Not your bargain, not your pity, not your burden to be thrown from one man to another. I will not be chained to cruelty. I will not bow to gossip. If you would spill blood tonight, let it be for truth, not for pride." Her groom snarled, face twisted. "Truth? The truth is you're unwanted. You'll die alone, fat and forgotten." Abigail's chest heaved, but she did not falter. She turned toward him, her eyes clear. "Then I will die free." The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Even the horses stilled, steam curling from their nostrils. For a long moment no one moved. Then Judge Harwood lowered his rifle, muttering, unwilling to shoot a woman who stood so unyielding. One by one the others faltered, pride bending beneath her defiance. At last, with curses and threats, they turned back, lanterns bobbing as they rode away. Her groom was the last to mount, spitting into the snow before vanishing into the darkness. The camp exhaled, the storm of violence dissolving into the stillness of falling flakes. Abigail collapsed to her knees, her hands shaking. Tears burned her cheeks, not from shame but from release. She had severed herself from the world that mocked her, and though the cost was heavy, the freedom was greater. Tahu knelt beside her, his presence steady, his silence deeper than words. He reached to lift her shawl from the snow, draping it gently over her shoulders. His fingers brushed her arm, warm despite the cold, and she felt the weight of his vow without him ever speaking it. She looked at him, really looked, and saw in his eyes not pity but recognition. The same scars, the same survival, the same hunger for dignity. The chief stepped forward, his voice low and solemn. He spoke words in his own tongue, then nodded to Abigail, to Tahu. The people murmured assent, their eyes softening. She did not understand every syllable, but she felt the meaning: acceptance, blessing, belonging. Her heart swelled until she could scarcely breathe. She had been mocked as too much, cast aside as not enough. Yet here in the circle of firelight, she was simply herself. She had chosen dignity over chains, and in that choice she had found something like love. Tahu reached into the pouch at his side, drawing forth a necklace strung with carved bone and beads of turquoise. With careful hands he placed it over her neck, the pendant resting warm against her skin. No words, no declarations, only the gesture, sacred as any vow. Abigail's throat ached with tears she could not hold back. The fire flared, sparks rising into the cold sky. The tribe sang low, their voices weaving into the night. Abigail closed her eyes, the sound wrapping her like the beaded blanket. She had been delivered to the wrong ranch, to the wrong man, to the wrong fate, or so it had seemed. But perhaps the storm had never aired. Perhaps God's hand had carried her exactly where she was meant to be. Snow fell soft, endless, blanketing the earth in light. She looked once more at Tahu, his eyes steady on hers, and in them she saw a future not yet written but waiting. And as the fire's glow deepened, she knew the truth at last. Sometimes the wrong road is the only path home.